Greetings and welcome back to Room 303, and we turn now in our Harvard Classics lecture to lecture number 38 of the volume 5, the Emerson volume, and we're going to look at the speech address essay called Man the Reformer. This was a lecture address given to the Mechanics Apprentices Library Association in Boston, 25 January 1841, which is 3 years after the Divinity School address, which we lectured last. Hey, just to remind, I do recommend that you go to learnstrong.net, take a look down that left-hand side, find there where it says Harvard Classics, and take a look at lecture especially 35, because that's the one that will be the introduction to Emerson. Lecture 36, I've talked about American Scholar, and lecture 37, the Divinity School address. And now I'm looking at the next text in the Harvard Classics Volume 5, which is called Man the Reformer. We'll have to say something about that word man and ask, are we playing a patriarchal game of a kind here with the use of that word man? First of all, though, let's just remind, we're looking at Emerson from three perspectives in our study. One, we want to see Emerson as teacher, as man, as person. Okay, in our first view. That includes the challenges of his life, especially the difficulties of his life. I'll have more to say about that in this lecture. Because this address is Man the Reformer, is often considered one of Emerson's greatest optimistic diatribes, where he talks a lot about why you should be so happy. And it almost seems like maybe standing behind the optimism is a dark skepticism. A lot of scholars have pointed this one out. We'll talk about it. We'll talk about Emerson as philosopher, idealist, transcendentalist. And here we're going to include in this lecture Emerson's political views. And then finally we're looking at Emerson as artist or creator. That stuff we're looking at it to be not what he says, but how he says it. That's so significant to our study of Emerson as well. Now, just to remind, we're always working with our learning theory, that capacity to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. And again, we do that in very creative ways as we do it, if we do it at all. And so we're always kind of paying attention to the ideas that we've worked with before. Certainly, we've given 37 lectures from the Harvard Classics. We're trying to connect. We'll come back to some of that stuff. We're also working with our reading levels. Level 1, what does the text say? Level 2, what does the text mean? Level 3, how do we relate to the text? And at level 2 and 3, we subdivide 2A, messages, themes, 2B, the rhetoric I was just mentioning, 3A, how does this text relate to other texts I'm familiar with and to the world at large? And then finally, and most importantly, 3B, how do I relate personally to a text like this? I hope, as I've said in earlier lectures, that we stumble onto ideas that challenge you. I hope that that's the case. We'll see. First of all, a little bit of background information for the study of Man the Reformer address. First of all, we want to remind ourselves in lectures that I've given elsewhere, not for Harvard Classics, you can find them at learnstrong.net in the AP folder, my Plato's Republic lectures. The heart of Republic is a question that is often referred to as the myth of Gyges question. Gyges, you'll maybe remember, is that shepherd who discovers that ring, which when he puts it on and he turns it, he becomes invisible. For those of you that know anything about your Tolkien, this should sound familiar. And the fundamental question of the myth of Gyges, which by the way, I reinterpret as the myth of Maverick, for those of you who have followed that lecture. The question is, if I had power to do anything I wanted, why would I use that power for good and not for ill? That's the question of the myth of Gyges. Or, to use Plato's language, what is justice? Now that question will be standing in large measure behind some of the information that Emerson's going to play with in Man the Reformer. Number 2, for background information. We're going to have to ask about Emerson's optimism. Is it a little over the top? Is it possible that standing behind the optimism is in fact a dark skepticism? In other words, is Emerson struggling with the way the world is? Which takes us, number 3, to an observation that we've made before from Machiavelli's Prince. Machiavelli in The Prince is critiquing the idea of Plato in Republic. And it's what we call the is-ought dichotomy. Now I know you know this, but let's remind you. The is-ought dichotomy. Machiavelli says it this way. I am not interested in listening to what a bunch of romantic idealists have to say about the way the world ought to be. I'm rather interested in being a realist and talking about the way the world actually is. So this is-ought dichotomy is a dichotomy between idealism, there's a certain way I would love the world to be, it ought to be this way, versus realism. This is the way the world is, and if you don't like it, then I'm sorry, but you need to wake up and like smell something that tells you that it's real, that the world is the way that it is. And it's not surprising that we will point out that both Machiavelli and, of course, the English philosopher Hobbes will say the same thing in their realism. That human beings are inherently disgusting, they're fallen, they're nasty, and for you to expect that the world's going to be this amazing, can I even say it because it's going to be here in our essay, bright sunshine is a joke and you should just get over it. Well, there's another question that Emerson is going to raise. And I like to raise these questions in advance so that as we get into this essay, you can debate with yourself and with your pals about, where you come down on this one. The Emersonian question, can I actually change? Can you actually change? And then, really important in this essay, can we actually change or reform the world? Okay? I'll say it again, and it may be a different parlance. Can the individual actually change? Is that possible? Do you have a deterministic view of human nature that says humans are what they are, vis-a-vis their DNA or whatever, and there is no changing myself? Or do you rather believe that with enough discipline, that's going to be a huge one, by the way, in this essay for Emerson, you actually have the capacity to change and become a different kind of person? Do you believe the group can change? Right? So, for example, we're going to hear in this essay, Emerson seems to suggest humans have the ability to change individual selves. But to change the world, that is to say, from psychology to sociology, to change the group, that one is a little bit more thorny, a little bit more difficult, okay? Of course, Emerson's going to argue, you can't change a whole bunch of people until an individual himself or herself changes, right? Of course, Emerson's going to argue that the goal is to leave the world a more awakened place than you found it by helping first yourself and then other people. We're all familiar with people who want to change us, but they themselves are so jacked up that we can't help but say, look, why don't you just worry about yourself? Or as, of course, Jesus Christ said, physician, heal thyself. In other words, don't tell me how to fix me when you yourself have all kinds of problems. Okay? I do argue, and I will make this argument in my lecture, that I think Emerson is misunderstood. I think Emerson is misunderstood in general about his optimistic views, but I think he's very much misunderstood in Man the Reformer as an essay that argues that Emerson's agenda is to somehow change the world or reform the world. Notice here, the title of the essay is Man, singular, the Reformer, not Men, the Reformer. I think that's an important distinction, and you should write it in your notes. We'll come back to it, right? Of course, we get to wrestle with a classic example that Emerson could not have wrestled with because, of course, Emerson came before Gandhi and Hitler. Think about how the 20th century offers up to us two examples of lives that will play this game of Machiavelli's Prince, right, the is-ought dichotomy, in Gandhi's inclusivity versus Hitler's exclusivity, right? Hitler, of course, is going to be the grand example of an individual that borrows heavily from Machiavelli. The book stayed beside his nightstand all his life. And, of course, Hobbes, as we are presented with it in the great text Leviathan. You'll remember that Hobbes said, every man considers every other man his potential assassin. You can't hardly get a much discouraging view of human nature than that one. So Hitler kind of has that view. Nasty as you can be to gain the power that you need to have some ability to run the world. Then you have Gandhi. the great Gandhi, who of course through his view of inclusivity is going to argue that all humans have the capacity to change the world by, remember the quote, being the change that they hope to see in the world. In other words, if you want to change the world, you begin by changing yourself. So this tension is going to be evidenced in this essay, Man the Reformer. Let's study this call to faith, hope, and love. All three of those virtues that we qualify, of course, as Christian virtues from our study of 1 Corinthians 13 out of the New Testament, the Christian New Testament. But all three of those virtues, of course, are very ancient ideas that faith, hope, and love can somehow actually alter or change the world. I recommend that the first thing you do as you're looking at this essay, if you have a print copy of it, is to go ahead and number those 24 paragraphs, because that's how I'm going to reference it, just like I've been referencing it in our earlier lectures. Let's go ahead and work now, level 1, what does this text say, and go all the way through it. And I'm going to start with the title, Man the Reformer. Now, of course, we've had our lectures on Milton and his patriarchal, we could even argue misogynistic views, that of course we're going to blame the problems of the world on the fact that Eve and her curiosity led herself and then of course her man to eat from the forbidden fruit. When Emerson uses the word man, is he talking gender? I need to say this to you because it's important. Emerson is one of the first great male feminist voices of the American tradition, no question. So when he uses the word man, he actually doesn't even mean humanity. This is huge for your notes. Go back to our earlier lecture, that two-box theory where we were playing the game of Plato's theory of the forms. In the first box, the physical. In the second box, the metaphysical. When Emerson uses the word man, he is almost always emphasizing not gender, male, female, but rather body versus soul. So this is the first insight, and I think this is why so often this essay and much of Emerson's philosophy is misunderstood. Emerson, when he uses terms like man, when he uses terms like nature, he isn't speaking specifically about a male body versus a female body, nor is he, for example, talking when he talks about nature, Ruthie's tree. He's talking about nature with a capital N, as we've said in that previous lecture. So right away, let's make sure we understand that Emerson is saying that the soul is capable of reform. Okay? That's huge. That is to say, reforming itself and reforming society at large. All right? Now, let's work through it, and we'll begin in paragraph number 1. Well, what is the goal? The goal for Emerson is that all Americans are free and helpful men. That is to say, everything for Emerson always seems to come back to freedom. That is significant, just like we were saying in our last lecture, because freedom is at the heart of this notion of justice, this notion of duty, right? For example, he will say it this way, "Further, I will not dissemble my hope that each person whom I address has felt his own call to cast aside all evil customs, timidities, limitations, and to be in his place a free and helpful man, a reformer, a benefactor, not content to slip along through the world like a footman or a spy, escaping by his nimbleness and apologies as many knocks as he can, but a brave and upright man, i.e. soul, who must find or cut a straight road to everything excellent in the earth, and not only go honorably himself, but make it easier for all who follow him to go in honor and with benefit." Now, this is one of those tensions that we're going to see in Emersonian philosophy. He loves to talk about man. He rarely likes to talk about men. When he talks about men, he usually is talking about the first box, politically speaking. That is to say, the mob. Machiavelli himself said it, "He who builds on the people builds on mud." This debate in Emersonian philosophy and political theory has always been at the heart of misunderstandings, because, of course, Emerson's diatribes against democracy are not against the notion of democracy as freedom, but rather the idea that the mob, the group, often will drive the agenda, and for Emerson, he's got problems. In paragraph 2, he'll argue, now is the time for reform. All order is threatened, of course, he will say this. All order, traditions, are threatened by the new spirit, Emerson as iconoclast, as we've said before. All reformers, of course, he will say, have to put up with the fact that when they begin to ask what's wrong with the world, inevitably there's going to be some debate about how you fix it. And of course, institutions of stability, can I use that term? Institutions of stability will have a tendency to get a little bit freaked out, right? When someone starts to say, I think we can do this better. I think this can be reformed, this system, this institution, whatever. We come to paragraph number 3. It's a brief paragraph, but it's an important one, and I think it's the beginning of many of the debates about this essay. What if, he says it this way, what if some of the objections whereby our institutions are assailed are extreme and speculative, and the reformers tend to idealism? And again, Emerson's overstating this one, right? That only shows the extravagance of the abuses which have driven the mind into the opposite extreme. It's when your facts and persons grow unreal and fantastic by too much falsehood that the scholar flies for refuge to the world of ideas and aims to recruit and replenish nature, capital N, nature from that source. Let ideas establish their legitimate sway again in society. Let life be fair and poetic, and the scholars will gladly be lovers, citizens, and philanthropists. Okay, so let's put it in our notes right away. This is kind of the shot across the bow right away. He says it. When you look at the world, do you see anything wrong? If you don't, you're blind. And if you see something wrong with the world, then you got to begin to ask, how do we fix it? Ergo, man the reformer. Paragraph 4. He talks about the demon of reform. Let's talk about that. The demon of reform has a secret door into the heart of every lawmaker, of every inhabitant of every city. The fact that a new thought and hope have dawned in your breast should apprise you that in the same hour a new light broke in upon 1,000 private hearts. Now, I said this in an earlier lecture, in my intro lecture to Emerson, and I think it's important to reiterate. Emerson is very much about challenging you to ask, who are you? What do you mean, who am I? I'm this body. No. I know you're this body. But you're also a mind. And if you are a mind, then that means you're somehow special. Your consciousness, your energy is special. Once you come to accept that fact, then the next question is, who are you? That is to say, not me, but the other. Because I can only define the other once I've sought to define myself. Right? But if you accept that you are energy, if you accept that you are special in regards to a soul or a spirit or energy, consciousness, if you accept that about yourself, then you must accept that for any other human being who you meet. In other words, if I am divine, Emerson will say, then so is every other I, every other individual, every other person. And if that's the case, then finally, of course, there is the we. When an I and a you get together to form a we, there is something really magical about that. And Emerson says that young people especially, who grow frustrated with institutions and systems of stability that don't want to change, they can grow so frustrated that they begin to run towards idealism, but that's only because the people who they're talking to just don't get it. Of course, this takes us back to Plato's Republic, Book 7, and the cave allegory. Individuals sitting in the dark, looking at shadows on a wall, think that they are real. They don't know anything else. That's all that they know. In paragraph number 5, we have the statement of the problem. This is a really important paragraph, so if you're studying this essay with me, you need to make sure that you read this one for yourself. I can't read it all. As I've said before, I would love to be able to read all of this essay, but I haven't the time, so let's go quickly. First of all, he'll say it. It's fairly self-evident from what we just read. It's called the block path. In other words, young people, for example, who look at the world and say, things should be a lot different than they are. Why can't we fix them? Paths are blocked, right? To succeed, he says, one must almost forget his prayers, it seems. This is the Glauconian argument of Republic 2, when Glaucon said, you cannot be a philosopher. By definition, a philosopher for Plato is what it is for Emerson. Go back to that last lecture. You're more interested in that second box than that first box. The metaphysical is greater than the physical. It's not that the physical doesn't exist. It's that the metaphysical, that other box, is way more important. A beautiful body fades, sags and bags, as we said. But the concept of beauty has legs. It goes on. It is not a physical, right? You can't touch, give me 3 pounds of beauty. No, no, no. But that's not to say beauty doesn't exist. In fact, Plato argues, as does Emerson, it's way more important. But here's the problem. If you want to live following that second box, that is to say, more interested in the metaphysical than the physical, then you live in a world that's going to struggle to understand who you are and to accept you. In this regards, he will say it in paragraph number 5, that we are all implicated. I'll read it. We're all implicated, of course, in this charge. It's only necessary to ask a few questions as to the progress of the articles of commerce from the fields where they grew to our houses to become aware that we eat and drink and wear perjury and fraud in 100 commodities. Wow. His attack then, right away, is going to sound a lot like T.S. Eliot's hollow men. We are the hollow men. We are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw. Alas, our dry voices, when we whisper together, are quiet and meaningless as wind and dry grass, a rat's feet over broken glass in our dry cellar. T.S. Eliot, obviously very influenced by this important information, right, of Emerson, and there's no question that we're playing the same game. He continues by commenting for the first time in this essay on the abolitionist movement. He says it, the abolitionist has shown us our dreadful debt to the Southern Negro. It's in this moment that Emerson will remind us of that story that I gave to you earlier, where Emerson is sitting at a church meeting and he is trying to enjoy the experience of a worship assembly, but right outside of that building, he can hear the slave auctioneer who is saying, "Going gone," about a human being. And the cognitive dissonance that's at play in Emerson's mind at that